Alrighty, here we are. I'm extremely excited. Sixth episode now of NYC Bike Culture with Charlie Issendorf. Pronounced it correctly, I hope. I'm very excited of Charlie here. I think he's one of those central figures that you have in different cycling communities or communities. If you haven't come across Charlie, if you have been at a Prospect Park race, you've at least heard his voice. And you've probably seen him and you didn't know who he was. I think the moment you see him, you hear him talk, there's a lot of energy there, and a lot of excitement about cycling as a sport, especially. And he's now a race promoter, first and foremost. He worked for Zwift. But he's also had a long history as a racer. I'll let him tell us more about his accolades and his achievements. I think through the Casino Cycling Club, organizing the Prospect Park races, he used to organize for a long time also the Tuesday night series at Floyd Bennett Field, which he just passed over hand over the baton for that. I think we can talk about more of that. Charlie is a really central figure, and I'm really excited to have him here because I want to talk a little bit about him as a bike rider and racer, but also a lot about the race promoting bit. And I think this may take us two separate conversations because there's a lot to unpack. So let's start. Charlie, what got you into sport? How did you end up getting into cycling?
That was 100% my dad. So I grew up with bike racing as long as I can remember. My dad was taking me to Wednesday night track races at the Casino Velodrome.
Okay.
Like I said, as long as I can remember, 4 or 5 years old. Somerville was a huge weekend for us, the family. We would go watch Somerville.
So you went out to New Jersey because you lived in Queens?
I lived in Queens, yeah.
So the Velodrome was like probably next door by New York standards, probably?
Yeah. Well, back then you could get anywhere in Queens in 15 minutes. We're talking probably, we're talking, over 40 years ago. Just growing up in the sport, right? And going to, like I said, going to Somerville, that was a huge weekend. Like, that's what you did on Memorial Day, right? Like, you packed up the car. Yeah, you went out to New Jersey. And I guess I was probably around 6 or 7 when I told my dad I wanted to race.
Wow, okay.
And in what was formerly USCF, United States Cycling Federation, that was the predecessor of USA Cycling, you couldn't start racing until you were 8. And I think that rule is still true.
That could be.
I'm pretty sure it's still 8 years old. That's when you could get your license. You couldn't have a license until you were 8 years old. So at 8 years old, I got my license. And I had, and it wasn't back then, it wasn't your birth date on January 1. It's like when you turned 8, right? So my birthday's in July, so I had to wait like mid-season, right? So like on July 19th, my birthday, I got a license, right? And we went out to the track. My dad took me out to the track. So that's another thing too, right? Like my first race was on a track bike, right? Like my dad had bought me a track bike. I started racing at 8 years old in what was formerly known as midgets, which was not a politically correct term. But that was the division. It was called midgets. And midgets was 8 to 11, and I think now it's just called
that
junior.
Was the description for the age group. Unofficially or
officially? Like if you read the race flyer, it'd say midgets start at 8 a.m. Intermediates was the next division.
Okay.
Then juniors, seniors.
Okay, so junior came up. Okay, so it was just kind of dropped then, just said junior, and then put the age group after that.
Exactly. And I think actually it's junior 9 to 11 now. I don't think you can start racing at 8, but back then you could start racing at 8 years old. And I fell in love with it. It became my life, obviously. And from there, I just got more engulfed in the sport, right? Track racing led to road racing. And then I just graduated through the various junior divisions. And it was a lot of struggle in the early years. The first division, the 8 to 11 year olds, I was good, right? Like I won a lot of races and I was fast. But when I graduated to the next division, the junior, I guess 12 to 15, what was formerly known as intermediates, I was very small for my age.
You were 12 now.
I was 12 and I'm racing against 15-year-old monsters, right? Who were just like destroying me.
Because they're now in puberty and growing.
So like I'm on the start line looking up at these guys and I was like, these guys are gonna kill me, right? Like in junior 8 to 11, you had to race on 24-inch wheels. It was mandatory.
So it's
right?
smaller wheels.
Yeah, so it's small wheels. When I
makes
graduated,
sense, I guess. It'd be really hard to put big, like regular wheels on like small bikes.
Yeah,
Like,
and everything was customized back then. So I had 150 millimeter cranks. I had 34 centimeter bars.
Wow.
So everything was like, shrunk down, because that classification back then was a real classification. In Europe, it still is, not in America, but in Europe they still have these
With
mini
rules.
bikes. Yeah. So when I graduated to intermediate, I could barely fit like on a 700C bike.
Right.
Like
right,
I think I had a 48 centimeter bike, and the seat post was all the way down.
Yeah.
It's just to give you an idea of how small I was. Like this bike was way too big for me. But it was mandatory when you got into intermediates, you had to race on 700C wheels.
Yeah.
When I was still really on like 24-inch wheels. And that was like my proper bike size, and I got my ass kicked for like at least 2 years. I mean, I was getting pulled out of races because I was so far behind, like when they pull lapped riders and stuff like that. And for me it was difficult, and my dad always said, he's like, Charlie, you're gonna grow up, and I was like, Dad, this isn't fun, right? Like, I'm just losing.
Like, you must have at some point at least felt like this isn't fun anymore.
Yeah, it was tough. But my dad, who was always my biggest supporter, was always telling me, Charlie, it's gonna come, right? Like you're gonna grow up. It's not gonna be like this forever. And sure enough, after those first 1 or 2 rough seasons, I came, right around when I was 15 years old, right? Like I came into my own. Had a growth spurt. And all of a sudden, I was back to being competitive. So that was a lot of fun again.
So it was worth it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, sticking with it. So your dad was. So when you mentioned Somerville, you went there because your dad was racing then, or
no?
Because he was just part of that community already.
My dad started racing in 1956. So he was about, I guess, 16 or 17 years old when he started racing.
Also fairly young.
So he was young. And he got into racing because he used to have a paper route back then, when people used to literally ride bikes and hand out papers. And all his friends were racing. That was like the thing to do.
Okay.
Right? So all his friends were racing, and they're like, oh, you should come on out and start racing. He started racing because all his friends were racing.
This is all through the velodrome again? Or?
Well, there wasn't even a velodrome back then. So
I was going to say, Casino was 60s? When did that come about?
Casino, I think, was 65 or 64. They used to race at what is now, I guess, Citi Field. It was formerly known as Shea Stadium. It wasn't even a true velodrome. It was like a parking lot. And maybe think of it like a Floyd Bennett Field, right? Where they put out cones and kind of made it like a track on track bikes.
Those still exist around the country, where you have a weekly parking lot crig where they set up a course with cones and whatnot. So
that's, that was racing it. And back then, road bikes were very rare, right? Like road bikes were, people were using them in Europe, but it was a very European thing. Everybody raced on a track bike. When I see things about like, Red Hook and fixed gear racing, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. It's never been done. I was like, that's how everybody raced. Once in a while they would put on a front brake, but most of the time it was just straight up track racing. It was like Red Hook style.
So even those parking lot ones?
Oh yeah, always. And they had 2 gears, 74-inch. You train on 74-inch and you race on 84-inch, right? Which is like a 48. I guess it's like a 48-15 or a 48-14, something like that, and dual-sided hub, so you changed it around. Right? So this is your training gear was a little lighter, and then you flipped it, and that was your race bike.
Well, these were the days where even if you didn't have the limitation of being a fixed bike, even on the tour, they weren't riding a lot of gears, right? I mean, they had very limited availability still. Like when we're talking about today's modern bike technology, none of that existed basically, right? So
So to answer to your question, my dad, my dad got me into racing, right? Like he got me into racing, and even though he had officially retired from racing, he still followed the sport, obviously, right? Like he still, as much as you could back then, right? Before internet, nothing was on TV.
No, or cycling wouldn't be.
He still followed the sport. He went to a lot of races to watch races, and he got me into it, and I'm extremely grateful because it was a life changer for me.
There's not that many. I talk a lot with other cyclists, and they're like the kids, and they ride their bikes, but they don't get into the sport, right? So I think you're maybe it's not the usual path necessarily to take what your dad did or was interested in and go with it, but clearly it's worked for you, and you've been a USAC member ever, well, since as early as you could be, and you might be for life. So as I've said before, I think we could dig into that a lot deeper still, but like, so you, by the age of say 18, when you're officially, I guess, a senior rider or under 23, whatever the category, I'm sure they didn't call it under 23 back then, but you had already been racing for 10 years. So you had a lot of experience already. And at that point, were you still in this with like a competitive drive to just see what you could do and maybe be on a, if not professional team, a really good amateur team? Like, what were your goals then when you were 16, 17, 18? Because I'm assuming that at that point you were like, I'm going to be an adult, I'm getting close in performance to some of these adult racers, what's my next step? Like, what were you thinking at the point? What were the goals? What happened?
I mean, it was a full-time job, right? Like, this is what I did. You know, I considered myself, you know, like a pro bike racer, even though I wasn't, but, you know, living the life, right? Also, I should emphasize that back then, you could make money off of bike racing, right? There was
to like a living wage kind of.
You know, for a 17-year-old kid, you know, I was probably winning maybe $300, $400 a weekend back in 1987.
Back then, in then money. Wow, so that was a lot of money.
A lot of money for a 17-year-old kid, and you know,
you didn't have to have a job.
No,
after that.
probably had a better job, right? Than some kid working, you know, delivering stuff. I don't know, but you know, entry fees with $3 or $5 back then. You know, so anywhere from $3 to $5. You know, I was sponsored, so all the equipment was paid for. So this was really just cash in my pocket.
Wow.
And it's also important to understand what bike racing was like back then, right? Like, you know, when I see teams now that are like continental teams, you see like Conti teams,
which is like, to briefly explain, the lowest level kind of professional you can be.
Correct.
To like, this is like the officially labeled professionals. We could argue for the de facto like earn a living wage, but you could say they are only doing that pretty much.
Correct. And it's, you know, officially you're a pro.
In
the eyes of you know, the UCI, the governing body of cycling, you have a professional license.
And you likely don't have another job, right? Because you don't have time for another job.
Correct.
You might do like a podcast for money.
So that was what we had. Let me start over. We didn't have Conti teams, right? So we had strong amateur teams, right? That probably would have been considered continental now. So I guess where I'm going with this is that back then you had amateur and you had pro. But pro was the best. Right. So it'd be like, you know, either you played in basketball in the corner, right, with your friends, or you're on the Lakers. That's it. There's nothing in between, right?
You're either riding the tour or you're not. And then you're an amateur. So you know, we had pro teams like Motorola, or 7-Eleven. These were the top teams back then in the 80s or 90s. To say those didn't come out, but these American pro teams didn't come about until like the 80s, right? And
they were the best, right? That was, like I said, it was the equivalent of like the Lakers, right? So there was nothing in between. So, you know, for me,
this was like Greg LeMond rode there, Lance Armstrong rode there, everybody, off name.
So for me as an amateur, you know, it was. I guess in the back of my mind was to see how far I could go. Like, could I get a contract on one of these teams? And I quickly realized that I wasn't at that level, right? Like, you know, it's a shame too. Another thing, you know, we didn't have U23 back then, right? So, you know, when I graduated from junior to senior, in some ways it was the same. It was me reliving graduating from the junior 9 to 11 to the 12 to 15.
Of course.
Right? So I went from being, you know, a good junior. I had gotten second at nationals, and I had done some really big races.
Thank you. Can I have the Bashinsky with sweet potato fries? Thank you. And you good fries?
Yeah, I'm good. So I graduated from being a junior. All of a sudden, I'm thrown in
Yeah.
with like seasoned pros, right? Who have, you know, I was racing junior distances, I was still racing junior gears, and now I can race, you know, with an 11 or whatever we had back, 12 probably back then. And you know, I had never raced in gears like this. 53.15 was our biggest gear as a junior. So, you know, we basically as a junior, and if you were a strong junior, you put it into the 15, and that's where you stayed the whole race. You really didn't need much. It was like that's it.
Because
that's
it's going so fast.
Yeah, it was, you know, unless it was like a hilly race. But if it was like, if you were doing crits and local races, you were probably in the 15 or 16. You're in your biggest gears probably most of your race. You know, all of a sudden, you know, I have a 12 and a 13 that I'm trying to spin out now, right? And you know, I'm racing longer distances, right? More aggressive racing.
Like say 20 miles to 80 miles, or like something like that.
Junior races typically in the United States have always been really short. Right, so like some of the criteriums we were doing, like Somerville is a good example, right? Like Somerville still is arguably the biggest crit, right, in the Northeast.
It still rings with the, I don't know if depending on what criteria, but I think it certainly has the history and the name to back it up. So
the junior race at Somerville was 15 miles, and the senior race is 50. Right, so it's not even comparable, right? Like a 15. I mean, it takes seniors 15 miles to warm up, right? Like that was our whole race. So while these races were super intense, like they shot off the gun and it was it. It was a drag race for 15 miles, because the race was probably about 30 minutes, right? We probably averaged close to 30 miles an hour.
You had to make it fast.
So you know, going from 15-mile races to 50-mile crits, it's a huge difference. And you know, road races, you know, maybe a good junior road race was at best 50 miles. You know, even those were rare, and you know, a good senior road race is close to 100. So it was rough. It was rough, and you know, I did well in my first year as a senior. My second year as a senior, I did even better. I won a stage race that was televised. I was only 19 years old back then.
I'm surprised there even was something televised. This is the 80s now we're talking. So I've seen some footage from that time.
It was a televised stage race that I won, and that got me some recognition. And I was, you know, regularly getting top 10 in Pro Cat 1-2 races. And then from there, I graduated to racing. With the U.S. national team in some events, right? So I did the Tour of Chile.
So you got selected for that, but for so there was probably an amateur division for the national team at that point, or you wouldn't have. But that would have been like the selection for the Olympics too, in some ways. So like those would have been the riders who you, like Alexei Graval, who went to the Olympics and won.
I mean, that was the top end, right, of the national team. You know,
and there's other races you go to, but still, you get selected for the national team.
And in the 80s, there was always like a national A team and a B team, right? So you know, while the best national team riders were probably doing like Tour de l'Avenir or some big stage race, big amateur stage race, you know, there was a level below that. So like, you know, I did Tour of Greece, I did Tour of Chile. Right, so I did these stage races, and they were hard fought, right? Because you also didn't have these continental teams in Europe, right? So you know, racing against the Belgian national team or the French national team or the Brazilian national team in Chile. You know, these guys were like pros, right? Like they were on well-sponsored amateur teams, right? And they were very well taken care of. And it was super competitive, but it was racing those events that I realized that, you know, I am not at that level. I am not at that level to turn pro. While I had some good results, you know, a good result is a top 10. You know, I am nowhere near winning these races. You know, it's a reality check, real quick.
I think some people realize quickly, and other people they get 10th and they're like, okay, next, like I can do this, you know, and then they hang in there for maybe too long. But And so at this point when you realize maybe the next step isn't going to be happening, how old were you?
I guess I was 22 or 23.
Okay.
Probably when I stopped racing at that level. Right. When I realized that, you know what, this is not what I'm meant to be, right? Like I love the sport and it's difficult. I think another race too. I did two races that ring a bell as being extremely difficult. One was Tour de Beauce in Canada. Right?
Still exists.
Which still exists. and that was a difficult race.
Yeah.
That was a difficult race, and just staying with the field, on these 100-mile days is so difficult, right? Like you can't even you're so tired and you're struggling so hard just to keep up. You can't even fathom what's happening at the front.
Right.
Like you're just trying to.
You're just busy staying in the field.
Yeah. And then another one was Tour of Texas, right? And Tour of Texas was an international stage race. Back in the 80s and 90s. Arguably, probably one of the most difficult stage races the country had. And it was on the level probably of like Tour of California, right? Like even though it was amateurs, it later became Pro-Am. So like Coors Light and 7-Eleven were there, and I was racing against those guys. And wow, what a difficult race! Like just again, I think we had 4 100-mile days in a row, and you're
amateurs,
suffering.
You won't usually get that.
And you're just suffering to stay in the group, right? And then like the motorcycle comes by, and they'll say like 7 guys. They hold up the board, it says the time gap, like 7 guys at 4 minutes, and you're like, how can they be 4 minutes ahead? How's that even possible? When I can't even like stay with this group, and they're 4 minutes ahead.
So those are the ones that really that
it's an eye opener. To say the least.
And I can imagine you're like out there in Texas, it's probably hot and whatnot, and it's gotta be rough.
And you come back and you're like, again, it's a gut check, right? Like, should I keep doing this, right? If I keep doing this for years and years, will my 10th become an 8th? That's probably the best it would be, right? It's not going to be 10th to winning.
Once in every other year or something like that. Right, and I think a lot of amateur racers can relate to that.
For sure.
Now, but we don't have the pressure of that being, because you were a pro at that point then, a 4 or 5 year old, if you don't mind, like you graduated from high school, so you finished that part of school, but I'm assuming then your job was cycling, and you spend, I don't know, 20 hours training, more, riding around New York City doing that? Or where did you train? You found
Long Island.
Parks? On Long Island?
Yeah, Long Island.
Again, back then was easier, with less traffic and fewer lights, or because today I always joke that it's great for racing here, but it's really, I don't think you could be a pro and train here these days, unless you want to go on Zwift all the time or something like that, or you really go in the park at 4 a.m. or something, but even then I don't think it would cut it, but it did for you.
Living in Queens may not be ideal, but getting to like the Long Island Expressway service road, again in the 80s it was different, right? And taking the service road out there and then hitting the North Shore of Long Island, there's a lot of hills, a lot of steep little climbs, a lot of back roads there that weren't as crowded as they are now. I mean, keep in mind that this is, I was training with Rich Hincapie and George Hincapie, and we would meet up out there. They already lived in Long Island, so we had it's so funny that, like, I was coming from Queens, they were coming from deep Long Island.
Thank you.
And, this is before cell phones. And we would say, meet at this corner at like 4 p.m., right, after school or whatever. And we just sort of arrived. I knew it took me about an hour and 15 minutes to ride out there. And you waited like 5 or 10 minutes, and if they didn't show up, you left, right? You assumed something happened. And I mean, that's how we trained. But the training was good out there. Training was good, and I think we all benefited from doing group rides. I should also add that I started motor pacing when I was 14. So my dad bought a motorcycle, a scooter, and he was motor pacing me, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours on the North Shore.
So that is even what today would be considered true pro training. So out there, I was just talking to Phil Castaldi the other day, and he mentioned seeing that happening in the park, and the days were different.
For sure.
So. So there was a community then of ambitious amateur or even future pro cyclists like George Hincapie, you mentioned, obviously went on to have a long career in the pro ranks, and so there were people to ride with and to pursue those goals. But you weren't like fighting there completely on your own, here.
And the scene back then was super strong, right? Like, junior races would sell out, right? Like the way.
Well, that was my other question. So like going for all these junior ranks, like when you go to junior races, a lot of the crits now, you have like, when you mentioned age group like 13, 14, you got a good field if you got 10, I would say. But that probably was different then? Or...
When I was a last year Junior 9 to 11, formerly known as midgets. 1981. On the start line, we had 42 riders. 42 riders on 24-inch wheels. If you can imagine that at Somerville, right? It's like a little pack, right? Like little packs
really
roaming around.
Yeah.
And then other races. Somerville, the field limit for juniors, I'll never forget, was 125, and you had to pre-register, right? Because it would sell out, right? And
what age group now? Like
15 to 17. Yeah. So 125 was the field limit. You had to pre-register, otherwise, like I said, it would sell out. And pre-registration was different back then, right? It was a self-addressed stamped envelope, and you mailed it in, and you hope the promoter got it, and you hope that they send out the envelope back to confirm your entry. And this was all within like a 2-week window, so you're checking the mail every day, right, to see if I got into Somerville.
Yeah. So you really had to be on top of things.
Yeah.
No. We'll get into that. No signing up the night before on bike reg.
No.
And
No, that didn't exist. But like I said, the community was strong, right?
Yeah.
Like, racing with Rich and George, we were teammates, but we really pushed each other. Mm-hmm. It was friendly competition, but of course I wanted to beat him and he wanted to beat us, and we still beat me, and we still had 120 other juniors to beat. Right.
But you were both from New York, and in some way there was a communal sense there of like we'll push each other, but we're representing the city, or we're New Yorkers. And
it was like I said, the junior scene was super strong. Mike McCarthy, right?
Yeah.
Went on to an illustrious pro career.
Yeah.
Right?
We can't discuss everybody's accolades here, but I think people can Google the names. Yeah.
A big time cycling community, right? Mm-hmm. Lots of races to do too.
So it feels bigger, but also smaller, the community back then. Is that what it was? I was assuming was it fewer people until maybe looking at the junior ranks, but overall, would you say there's more people riding and racing bikes now, or and the community was just tighter back then, or it feels different, right? But at the same time, like I said, smaller, but also bigger because you have a lot of people at races. So I don't know if that's too much of a change, but real quick, what do you think has changed in terms of that then, or has it changed much?
It has changed. There were definitely more people racing back then.
Okay.
Right? And you raced through the system of junior to senior to what was formerly known as veteran.
Right.
You didn't start racing.
Today's Masters.
Today's Masters.
Yeah.
You didn't start racing at 40, right? That's just unheard of, right? Everyone came through the junior ranks, right? Like you started racing when you were a teenager,
right.
Or in my case, even younger, right?
Yeah. But that was the standard.
That was the standard.
Which I think has completely flipped today.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I mean, maybe not completely that people always start at 50 or 40, but a lot of people start in the 20s or 30s or 40s.
Yeah. And it was just, it was like, I think how sports are today for baseball, probably for football, right? I don't think that has changed much, right? So you have, Pee-wee football, and you have Little League, right? And that's how you fall in love with the sport. And cycling was the same way, and it was much more family oriented, right? Like I couldn't get to the races, my dad drove me, but there was,
of course.
all the parents were there,
And you still see that today, right? With high school sports, that all the parents complain about having to drive the kids everywhere, but they're also there and enjoy that, right?
Soccer moms and all this stuff.
Yeah, all the stereotypes.
So that's how cycling was back then, right? Like you came into it early, and usually you stayed into it for a fairly long time. I mean, veterans back then, Masters, was more like old timers day, right? Like at Yankee Stadium, right? Like nobody was taking it that serious. They still loved to ride, but certainly they didn't have the latest equipment, and it wasn't like so cutthroat like Masters racing is now. It was like you were in the twilight of your career, right?
Yeah,
like you were just having still fun, and seeing the people you've known probably since you were like 15 years old, and you're still racing on the weekends and having a lot of fun. But it wasn't cutthroat. Today's racing, I like the fact that the community is tight knit, right? And I think it has a lot to do with social media, right? I think while Facebook can be horrible sometimes, it brings people together, right? And it allows people to stay in touch and just communicate better, right? Find out what other teams are doing. You know, in a lot of ways, you feel like you know someone before you even meet them, right? Like, you know, you bump into a team at a race, you're like, oh yeah, I saw you run last weekend. Well, how would you have known that?
Yeah,
right? Anywhere else, right?
Yeah, if you weren't there.
You know, that race is not going to be on cycling news. Right? So, you know, you find out about through social media, and I think it keeps people in check. But I think the community is in some ways a little tighter even now than it was. Even though it was bigger back then, I think it's tighter now.
That's interesting, because you think when you start at 8, or even other people start 10, 12, then you see the same people over 10, 20 years at the races, more or less, back then. And that's, again, we don't have that, but we have the virtual, the internet, the connection to social media and the internet. So how do you see it being even tighter? Is it that everything else is growing around us, and cyclists feel a little bit more threatened by everything else that's going on around us, and we're going to maybe get to that, like race venues disappearing or just getting harder to ride in some ways, or is it, what has changed?
Cycling, bike racing has always been fringe, right? Like we've always been on the edge, right? It's always been, you know, even back then, like, you know, let's race at 6 a.m. and get out of the park before anybody sees us, right? It's always been like a little cult following, right? Let's race at an abandoned airport, right? Like, you know, it's never been mainstream, it never will be mainstream, right? So it's almost like this code. Like, you know, I get it. Like, you're one of us, right? Like when you see somebody, it's this little like underground cult, this underground movement, right? And you know, you can relate to your fellow cyclists, right? And that was the same back in the 80s. You know, it's weird, because even though there were more cyclists, more racers, I should say, there were less cyclists. And there's a difference, right? So like, you know, back then in the 80s, if I saw somebody coming at me on the other side of the road, like in a kit, I was like, I must know him. Right? Like, you know, because nobody rode in kits back. Cycling just wasn't a thing. It wasn't a sport, right? It wasn't. I should say, it wasn't like a fitness sport, right? Like, you know, people jog, but it didn't have, you know, this following that it does now. Like on 9W, right? Like if you rode on 9W in the 80s and you saw a cyclist, you probably knew him. Right? You probably raced with him, right? You know, I mean, you can't say that now. You'll pass, you know, hundreds that you have no idea who these people are, right? But they look like you, and they have a fancy bike. So that's different. And that's a good sign, right? I think people get used to seeing people, you know, on bikes and in kits now. Whereas really it was like a freak show back in the 80s. If you saw like, what is he wearing, right? Like, what is he wearing? Or what is that guy doing?
That's interesting. So some things are better, some things are worse, as you would expect. Why don't we take a quick break right now, and then maybe cycle back, or no, actually transition to the race promoting, and then, like I said, maybe another conversation to talk more about your career and all that. Thank you.